The tree was still on fire when Darian pulled himself out of the wreckage. He did not remember the impact clearly. One moment the shuttle had been cutting through low cloud cover, the next the electromagnetic interference had eaten every system alive, and the whole machine had become a very fast rock. He remembered the altimeter spinning backward. He remembered the smell of burning polymer. Then he remembered mud on his face and a ringing in his left ear that would not stop. He lay on his back for a moment and looked up at the sky of Verath. Two suns hung low in the west, one pale gold and one smaller and bluer, stacked like coins. The forest around him was dense and strange. The trees had no bark in the traditional sense. Their trunks were smooth and faintly translucent, like frosted glass, and deep inside them something bioluminescent pulsed in a slow, rhythmic way, as if they were breathing. He got up. That was the first thing. You get up, then you assess. His right knee ached. His shoulder was worse. Something had torn when he hit the harness restraint at speed, and when he tried to lift his arm above his head, the pain was sharp enough to make him close his eyes. He took stock of what had come with him, a survival pack from under the seat, a xenobotany field kit that had survived in its hard case, and his personal scanner, which had a cracked lens but still powered on. The shuttle's emergency communicator had snapped from its mount on impact. He found it in the mud 6 meters away. The housing was cracked. When he switched it on, it produced a weak signal loop, not enough to reach orbit, but maybe enough for a nearby relay if he could find higher ground. He noted his injuries, he noted his supplies, he noted the direction of the suns. Then he started walking. He had been walking for 2 hours when he heard it. It was not a roar, it was not a scream, it was something smaller and more desperate than either, a sound like a large animal trying very hard not to make noise and failing every few minutes, low and rough and pained. Darian stopped. He stood still and listened the way his mother had taught him to listen in the deep forests of northern Scandia when he was a child, not for one sound, but for the pattern, where the sound repeated, how often, what it was moving toward or away from. It was not moving, it was stuck. He found the ravine by nearly stepping into it. It dropped about 3 meters, hidden under a shelf of root and overgrown moss, and at the bottom was a crystalline tree, one of the glassbark ones that had fallen sideways and wedged itself across the narrow width. And under one of the heavier branches, something was pinned. Darian crouched at the edge and looked down. It was a dragon. He had read about the Orath, the native dragon clan of Verath. Every xenobotanist who filed for a research permit on this planet received a briefing. Ancient species, isolationist, highly intelligent, do not approach, do not make eye contact, do not engage. The briefing had not mentioned that their hatchlings were this small. It was roughly the size of a large dog. Its scales were pale gold, the color of dry grass in late afternoon light, fatting to a soft ivory along the underbelly. Its wings were partially extended, one folded correctly, the other caught under the fallen branch, the thin membrane stretched at an angle that looked painful. Its eyes, when it looked up and saw Darian looking down, were deep amber, large, alert. It did not make a sound. Darian did not move for a long moment. The sensible choice was to walk away. He had a shoulder wound, a broken communicator, and no idea how far he was from anything. Getting involved with a dragon hatchling, especially an injured one, was the kind of decision that got xenobotanists listed as cautionary tales in training materials. He looked at the hatchling looked at him. The membrane of the trapped wing was beginning to tear at the edge from the pressure. Darian exhaled slowly. He sat down on the edge of the ravine, swung his legs over, and dropped down carefully. He landed wrong on the right knee and breathed through the pain. Then he straightened up and began talking. "Okay," he said, "I'm going to help you. I want you to understand that. I know you probably don't speak common, and I know you might try to bite me, and I want you to know I would consider that a very poor return on what I'm about to do." The hatchling watched him. It did not move, which he chose to read as cooperation. He opened the field kit. The sonic cutter was designed for tough root structures and crystalline bark. It would do. He worked carefully, talking the entire time, not because he thought it helped, but because silence felt wrong. He narrated every cut, every shift of the branch, every adjustment. It took nearly an hour. When the branch finally rolled free, the hatchling pulled its wing in fast and held very still, testing it. Then it stood. It shook itself once, the way a wet animal shakes, and the pale gold scales caught the dying light of both suns and threw it back in pieces. Darian sat down in the mud of the ravine floor, exhausted. The hatchling sniffed his outstretched hand. Then it sat down beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth coming off its scales, and stared at him with those amber eyes. Darian laughed once, quietly, and looked up at the sky between the ravine walls. "All right," he said, to no one in particular. "I promise I'll get you home before I find my own way out of here." He did not know then what those words would cost him. He did not know they would also be the most important words he ever spoke. On the first night, Sorvin brought him a dead animal. Darian had not named the hatchling yet. The name came later from the clan, but in his field notes he had to call the creature something, so he wrote subject S and told himself that was professional and not at all a sign of attachment. The animal Sorvin dragged into camp was about the size of a medium dog itself, six-legged, with a flat, broad skull and scales along its spine. It was very dead. The hatchling dropped it at Darian's feet with the particular energy of someone presenting a gift they were confident about. Darian scanned it, non-toxic, high protein. He cooked the hind portion over a small heat cell from his kit, watching Sorvin watch him the entire time. The hatchling did not eat its share raw until Darian had eaten his first, as if it was waiting to see if the cooked version killed him. It did not. It was, in fact, excellent. "Thank you," Darian said, and meant it. Sorvin blinked his amber eyes once slowly, and then began to eat. The second day was harder. Darian's shoulder had stiffened overnight, and the skin around the torn muscle was warm to the touch in a way that worried him. He cleaned it as best he could, wrapped it, and began breaking camp with one arm doing most of the work. Sorvin watched him struggle with the pack for approximately 30 seconds, then gripped the strap in his teeth and carried it. Darian stared at the hatchling. Sorvin stared back with an expression that was very difficult to read on a face that had no eyebrows, but somehow still managed to communicate. "Are we moving or not?" They moved. What Darian noticed over that second day was not that Sorvin was helpful, though he was. It was that the hatchling was watching everything he did with a focused intensity that did not feel like animal curiosity. It felt like study. When Darian used the scanner, Sorvin leaned in and looked at the readout. When Darian collected a sample of the bioluminescent moss growing on the glassbark trees, Sorvin sniffed the sample container and then sniffed the moss on the tree, and then looked back at Darian as if filing the information away. At midday, Darian found the ruins. They were set into a hillside, half swallowed by a century or more of root growth. The stone, if it was stone, was the same translucent material as the trees, but denser, cut into deliberate shapes. Archways, low chambers, walls covered floor to ceiling in carved symbols that shifted and caught light in ways that seemed almost alive. His scanner translated fragments. The Orath script was partially in the linguistic database, enough for rough meaning. Memory held, words spoken, debt carried. One passage repeated 3 times on different walls, each time slightly different in construction, but the same in meaning. A word given to a living being does not dissolve with intention. It persists until carried to its end. Darian read this twice. He thought about the ravine. He thought about what he had said at the end of it, sitting in the mud, to a creature that had no way to understand him. He put the scanner away. That afternoon, his shoulder became a real problem. The warmth had spread. When he checked under the wrap, the edges of the wound were angry-looking. He had antibiotics in the kit, but only a 3-day supply, and he was already on day 2. He sat against a glassbark tree and thought carefully about his options and did not let himself catastrophize, because catastrophizing had a known effect on decision-making, and his decisions needed to be good right now. Sorvin disappeared into the forest. He came back 20 minutes later carrying a clump of dark green moss, different from the bioluminescent kind. He dropped it in Darian's lap. Darian scanned it. The scanner returned a long string of compound data and flagged two components he recognized from his xenobotany work. One was a natural antimicrobial agent, the other was a compound that drew heat from infected tissue. Both had analogues in human medicine. Both were in here at significant concentration. He looked at Sorvin. Sorvin looked at him. "How did you know?" Darian said. No answer, obviously, but the hatchling lowered his head and pushed the moss closer with his nose. Darian applied it carefully, testing a small area first and waiting. No reaction. He applied it fully, wrapped it, and within 2 hours the heat in his shoulder had reduced enough that he could move the arm again. Not well, but enough. He sat in the fading light of both suns and wrote in his field notes. The bioluminescent trees around him pulsed slowly, shifting from pale blue to soft green as the temperature dropped. The forest was paying attention to him. He had started to feel, not with hostility, with something closer to curiosity. Sorvin curled at his feet, not close enough to be touching, but close. On the third morning, before Darian had even finished standing up, the hatchling was already facing northeast, toward the ridge that the scanner said would offer the best chance of signal strength. He had been watching the scanner readouts all along. He had already planned the route. Darian picked up his pack, which Sorvin immediately moved to take in his teeth, and looked at the pale gold creature who had fed him and medicated him and now intended to navigate for him. "Right," he said, "lead the way then." And Sorvin did. The ridge was not empty. Darian saw the shadows before he saw what made them. 4 of them, cast long and dark by the low angle of the double suns, falling across the stone like the shadows of buildings. He had time to register the size, very large, before the dragons themselves came into view, landing in near silence on the ridge above him with a precision that suggested they had been watching the approach for some time. He stopped walking. Sorvin stopped beside him. The 4 adult Orath were everything the briefings had described and several things they had not. The briefings had said large. These were enormous. The smallest of the 4 was still 3 times Darian's height at the shoulder, with a wingspan that would have covered the footprint of a standard research shuttle. Their scales caught the light differently than Sorvin's, deeper colors, richer, the kind of colors that had been settled and deepened by years. One was deep copper, one was dark bronze. 2 were variations of a deep, burnished gold. None of them were looking at Darian. They were looking at Sorvin. The copper one, the largest, the one who landed closest, made a sound that was less heard than felt, a resonance that moved through the ground and up through Darian's boots and into his sternum. Something in the frequency of it made his eyes sting, which was strange because it was not loud. Sorvin made a small, answering sound, high and clear, like a single note struck on a string instrument. The copper dragon descended from the ridge in 2 long steps and folded her wings and was on Sorvin in a moment, not violently, the opposite. She wrapped one great wing around him and lowered her head and pressed it against his, and the resonance deepened and Sorvin pressed back, and the sound they made together was something that Darian had no word for and knew he never would. He stood very still and looked at his boots and gave them a moment. When he looked up, all 4 adults were looking at him. One of them, the oldest by appearance, dark-scaled and heavy with age, his muzzle gone silver, his eyes a pale and very clear amber, took 3 slow steps toward Darian and stopped at a distance that was just short of comfortable. He spoke. The language was Orath, clicks and resonances and tonal shifts that Darian's scanner could barely parse. But then the old dragon paused, and when he spoke again, it was in common, imperfect, accented, shaped by a mouth that was not built for human phonetics, but clear. "You touched a dragon child." "I freed him from a fallen tree," Darian said. "His wing was caught. He would have torn the membrane if I hadn't cut the branch." "You touched a dragon child," the elder said again, the same words, the same tone, not anger, something more deliberate than anger. And you bound him with a word. Darian was quiet for a moment. I didn't know what that meant when I said it, he said carefully. I don't fully understand it now, but I said it, and I meant it when I said it. The old dragon looked at him for a long time. The pale amber eyes did not blink. Darian held the eye contact because looking away felt wrong, the same way looking away from something uncertain always felt wrong, like it would be noticed. My name is Garav, the elder said finally, elder of the Orath. The female behind you is Ruath. She is his mother. Darian turned slightly. Ruath, the copper one, had Sorvin fully wrapped in her wing now, her head still pressed to his. She had not looked at Darian since the first moment. All of her attention was on her son. Sorvin, from within the shelter of his mother's wing, was looking directly at Darian. I need to understand what I've done, Darian said, turning back to Garav. Not so I can undo it. I don't think I would, even if I could. I just need to understand. Something shifted in Garav's expression. Darian could not read it. The elder was silent for a moment that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Come, Garav said at last. It was not an invitation, but it was not precisely a command either. It was something in between, the way you speak to someone who has walked into a situation that is larger than them and has not yet realized it, and you have decided, against your better judgment, to walk them through it. Darian picked up his pack. Sorvin pulled free of his mother's wing and fell into step beside Darian, close enough that the pale gold scales brushed his arm. Ruath made a low sound. Sorvin did not change course. Garav watched this and said nothing. They walked down from the ridge toward the valley below, and as they descended, Darian saw for the first time what the tree line had hidden from above. Carved into the mountain on the far side of the valley, grown into and through and around with centuries of deliberate cultivation, was a structure of such size that it took him a full minute to understand he was looking at a settlement. Not ruins, not the remnant of something old. Something very much alive, very much occupied. The first human to enter Orath territory in recorded history walked through the gate at the valley floor as the double suns set behind the ridge, and the bioluminescent forest around him began its slow evening pulse, and somewhere above him, in the carved stone archways, a memory that would outlast every living thing on that ridge was already being made. He did not know that yet. He just kept walking. They gave him a room. It was carved from the mountain itself, smooth-walled and warm, with a sleeping platform built low to the ground and a wide opening in the east wall that looked out over the valley. No door. He did not know if that was trust or simply a reminder that there was nowhere useful to go. His interpreter arrived an hour after he was settled, a younger male Orath, bronze-scaled and precise in his movements, who introduced himself as Selev and spoke common with far more ease than Garav. He had learned it for trade negotiations, he said. He had not expected to use it like this. What is a memory weighing? Darian asked. Selev considered how to explain it. When something happens that does not have a clear place in our law, the elders weigh the memory of the event against what the law means, not what it says, what it means. The distinction matters. And what law applies here? The word law, Selev said. When a being speaks a promise aloud to another living being with full intent and awareness, the promise becomes part of the record. It carries weight. It must be honored, or it marks the speaker. I didn't know about the word law. That is part of what will be weighed. The council chamber was deep in the mountain, reached by a passage lined on both sides with memory glyphs. Darian's scanner worked on them as he walked. Fragments of translations scrolled across the cracked lens. Names, dates in Orath reckoning, events recorded not as facts but as felt truths, not what happened but what it meant. 700 years of history on these walls, and not a single non-Orath name among them. The chamber itself was circular and open at the top, a shaft of sky visible far above. 6 elder dragons sat arranged in a wide arc. Garav was at the center. Ruath sat to one side, not as part of the council, but present. Sorvin sat at the edge of the chamber, technically outside the formal space, watching. Garav spoke in Orath. Selov translated in a low voice at Darian's shoulder. He says a word was spoken to a dragon child in the wild. The child was in distress. The speaker is a human, a species with no standing in Orath law. The word was spoken in ignorance of its meaning. The question before the council is whether ignorance changes the weight of a word. One of the other elders spoke. Selov translated, "Law does not require understanding to be binding. The rain falls on those who do not know its name." Another spoke, "But the intent shapes the record. A word spoken to deceive has a different mark than a word spoken in good faith." Back and forth, Darian listened and did not interrupt. Then Garav turned to him directly and spoke in common. "You have heard the shape of the question. Speak if you have something that belongs in the weighing." Darian thought for a moment. "Can I ask something first?" he said. Garav's expression did not change. "Ask." "What does this mean for Sorvin?" The chamber went quiet, not the quiet of consideration, the quiet of surprise. Garav said nothing for a moment. Then, "You do not ask what it means for yourself." "I know what it means for me," Darian said. "I made a promise, I kept it. Whatever the law says about that is the law's business. I'm asking what it means for him." Ruath made a sound from her position at the side. Low, soft. Selov did not translate it, but his posture changed slightly. Garav looked at Darian for a long moment. Then, for the first time, something moved behind those pale amber eyes that had not been there before. "It means," Garav said slowly, "that the hatchling has named a being as someone who kept a word. In our culture, that is significant. Even among our own kind, it is significant. A hatchling's first memory of trust shapes the record of who they become." "Then I'm glad I stopped," Darian said, "whatever it costs me." From the edge of the chamber, Sorvin spoke. It was short, 4 words, maybe 5, in common that he had been assembling in silence over 3 days of listening. The pronunciation was imperfect and the grammar was wrong, but it was completely clear. "He did not leave. No one moved." It was not the words themselves. Darian understood that from the way Selov breathed next to him, a short intake, then nothing. It was the fact that the hatchling had already begun encoding the human in the memory songs, the Orath oral record, their living history. Darian was already in it. Garav adjourned the council without a ruling. He needed time, he said. The weighing was not finished. Darian walked back to his room. He sat on the low sleeping platform and looked out at the valley, going dark under the 2 moons, and thought about the ruins he had found in the forest and the inscription on the wall. A word given to a living being does not dissolve with intention. His broken communicator buzzed. The signal loop had found a relay. A human ship had responded, a research vessel 2 days out. They were asking if he was alive. He was, he told them so. Then he sat with the communicator in his hand for a long time. Then he sent a second message. He asked them to wait. 2 nights after the council, Selov came to Darian's room at dusk and told him to follow. He did not explain where. When Darian asked, the bronze-scaled interpreter simply said, "There are things that have to be seen to be carried correctly. Words for this exist, but they are not enough." The settlement had changed, not in structure, but in feeling. The carved stone passages that had been quiet and empty now held Orath of every age and size, moving in a slow, deliberate way toward the central open space at the heart of the mountain. Hatchlings smaller than Sorvin, elders larger than Garav. Some Darian had not seen before, members of the clan who lived in the outer reaches and had come inward for this. He was the only human in every direction. No one moved toward him. No one moved away. They simply moved around him the way a river moves around a stone, without hostility and without welcome, and he understood that whatever he was here, he was not yet named. He was something that had not been seen before and would require time before the language for it existed. Selov brought him to a raised platform of stone at the edge of the central space and told him to stay there. Then he stepped away. The ceremony began at the rising of the second moon. Pale silver fire appeared first, dozens of torches along the high walls of the settlement lit from above and below, until the whole space was caught between reflected torchlight and the bioluminescent pulse of the stone itself, which had absorbed the light of the Verath suns for centuries and now gave it back in slow, soft waves of blue-green. The effect was impossible to describe, so Darian did not try, he just looked. Selov returned and spoke quietly at his shoulder. The night of carried light, when a hatchling returns from their first solo survival, their first time alone in the wild, they release a lantern for each being who helped them return. The lantern is made from a resin the hatchling produces themselves. When it burns in the color of the maker's breath fire, not the color they were given, the color that lives inside them. Darian looked out at the central space where Sorvin now stood. The hatchling looked different in the ceremony light. Older, not larger, he had not grown noticeably in a week, but more certain, the way some people look more themselves at particular moments than at others. Sorvin held two lanterns. They were roughly spherical, slightly irregular, made from something that looked like dried resin set around a thin internal structure. Simple, the making of them must have taken days. The first lantern was for Ruath's search party. Sorvin raised it and touched a claw to the base where the ignition point was set and the resin caught. The flame that bloomed inside was copper, deep and rich, and exactly the color of his mother's scales. He released it upward and it rose, caught a thermal current from the torches, and climbed toward the open shaft of sky above the settlement. The sound the clan made in response was not something Darian had heard before. It was not applause. It was more like a low resonance, a frequency produced by many voices at once without coordination, naturally harmonic, the kind of sound that seemed to come from the ground rather than from bodies. Sorvin turned. He looked directly at Darian across the width of the central space. Then he walked toward him, deliberate and unhurried, carrying the second lantern. He stopped at the base of the stone platform and held it up. Darian came down from the platform and crouched to the hatchling's level and looked at the lantern. Up close, he could see the care in it. The resin was layered, multiple applications, each dried before the next was added, the structure inside built from something that looked like glassbark fibers. Days of work, done quietly between all the other things. Sorvin touched his claw to the ignition point. The flame bloomed. Darian had expected gold. Sorvin's scales were pale gold. His breath fire, in the brief moments Darian had seen it, had been warm and amber-toned. The flame was amber, deep, warm, pure amber, the color of Sorvin's eyes. Not the color of his scales, not the color someone looking at him from the outside would choose. The color that lived inside him. Sorvin released the lantern. It rose. The clan made the sound again, but this time it was different in quality, longer, layered, like the first sound had a question in it and this one had an answer. Selov spoke at Darian's shoulder and his voice was quieter than usual. He did not give you his name color, he gave you his light color, the color he sees when he thinks of the world as it should be. Darian said nothing. It means he considers you part of what he is, Selov said, not a debt, not something the law required, a piece of his story. Above them, the two lanterns had joined hundreds of others. The clan had kept every lantern from every previous ceremony on long tethers anchored to the high walls, and in the light of the second moon, they all moved together in the thermal currents, copper and bronze and gold and pale silver and deep green, filling the open shaft of sky above the settlement with a slow turning field of color. Darian looked up at it for a long time. Garav appeared beside him. He did not apologize for the council. He was not that kind of being, but he spoke, and Selov translated without being asked. Your kind makes promises without knowing their weight, the elder said, and then carries them anyway. We did not expect that. He walked away without waiting for a response. Darian stayed where he was, looking up at the lanterns, and tried to memorize every detail of it, knowing he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe something that did not have adequate words in any language he knew. The rescue ship came down on the eastern ridge at mid-morning. Darian heard it before he saw it, the low-pressure shift of atmospheric entry, the specific harmonic vibration of a mid-class research vessel dropping through dense air. He had spent enough time on shuttles and ships to recognize the sound the way a person recognizes the footsteps of someone they know coming down a hallway. He was already packed. There was not much to pack. He had arrived on this planet with a survival kit and a broken communicator, and he was leaving with the same, plus a shoulder that had healed to about 70% and a field notebook that was almost entirely full. Sorvin walked with him from the settlement to the ridge. He had shown up at Darian's room before first light and sat in the doorway without making a sound. When Darian had finished writing the last of his notes and stood up and put on his pack, the hatchling had simply turned and led the way out, as if that was the arrangement, as if they had agreed on it. The settlement was quiet as they passed through, a few adults in the outer passages, Garav at the main archway, not blocking it, just present, standing at the side in a way that was still somehow an acknowledgement. Darian stopped for a moment. "Thank you for explaining things," he said, "even when you didn't have to." Garav regarded him. "The weighing is not complete," he said. "We have not finished deciding what you are in our record." "That's all right," Darian said. "Take your time." Something moved in the elder's expression. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recognition, the way you look at something you had categorized wrongly and are now having to recategorize. He said nothing more, and Darian moved on. The double suns were both up by the time they reached the ridge. The research ship sat on the flat stone with its landing struts down, smaller than it had seemed from the valley, the hull marked with the pale blue insignia of the Galactic Assembly Science Division. The entry ramp was already lowered. 3 crew members stood at the base of it. They saw the hatchling at the same moment the hatchling saw the ship. Darian watched all 3 of them freeze in that particular human way, the stillness of a person recalibrating what kind of situation they are in. One of them, a young woman near the ramp controls, had her hand partway to her communicator and then thought better of it. Nobody spoke. Darian walked up to them. "I'm Cole, Darian Cole. I filed the research permit in April." He shook the nearest hand, which belonged to a heavyset man with a medic's badge on his jacket. "I have a shoulder wound that could use looking at." "We see that," the medic said, still watching Sorvin. "Is that?" "Yes. They're not supposed to. He's making an exception." Darian crouched down to Sorvin's level. He had thought about what to say on the walk up from the settlement. He had considered several things and discarded most of them for being too large or too small for the moment. "I'll write about you," he said. "People should know you exist, all of you. I'll try to get it right." Sorvin looked at him with those amber eyes. Then he spoke. The comment was careful and slow and clearly practiced, each word placed as if he had been turning them over in private for days. "I will remember you in my first song." Darian did not immediately respond. He knew from Selov's patient explanations what a first song was. It was the memory composition a young Orath created to define the shape of their own identity. It was sung once and only once, privately, and never repeated. It was the most personal record a dragon carried. It was who they had decided they were. He was going to be in it. He stood up. He put one hand briefly on Sorvin's head, between the small ridges above the amber eyes, and the hatchling pressed upward into it just slightly. Then Darian picked up his pack and walked up the ramp. The medic was already gesturing toward the medical bay. The other 2 crew members were still looking at the ridge. Darian sat down in the first seat he found and let the medic start on his shoulder and looked out the small viewport as the ramp closed and the engines began their pre-lift sequence. On the highest point of the ridge, Sorvin had climbed to the topmost stone and spread his wings. Not fully, one was still healing, the membrane marked by the faint line of where the branch had pressed too long, but fully enough. both wings out, catching the morning light, the pale gold scales lit to something almost white at the tips. From somewhere in the hatchling's chest, a single pulse of breath fire rose into the air above the ridge, warm amber gold, not large, controlled. Not a threat, not a warning. A salute. The ship lifted. The ridge fell away below them. The forest spread out in every direction, the glassbark trees catching the double sunlight and throwing it in 1,000 directions at once. And somewhere in the valley beneath the mountain, a settlement 700 years old was already incorporating this morning into its memory record. One of the crew spoke behind him, quietly. "What was that?" Darian watched the ridge until the cloud cover took it. "A memory being made," he said. 6 years later, the Orath opened diplomatic contact with the Galactic Assembly for the first time in recorded history. They had one condition. The human representative must be someone entered in the Orath memory record under a specific title, a title that had not been granted to any non-dragon in 7 centuries. Word keeper. There was, as it turned out, only one human who qualified. He accepted the post on the condition that he could bring his field notebooks. He had been meaning to have them properly archived for years. He thought the Orath library, with its walls full of memory glyphs and its 700 years of kept records, might be the right place for them. He was not wrong.